So, who do we have here today?
Hi, I'm Carlo McCormick and Matthew Shipp.
Hello, I'm Matthew Shipp, jazz pianist. Carlo is a very eminent cultural writer, art writer, and historian of the Lower East Side.
There we go, we have that.
Yeah.
So should we start up?
Yes.
Now, should we talk about the past or the present, and do we know the difference anymore?
I'm extraterrestrial, so I don't exist in the time zones.
Okay.
that-
So we'll just-
I'm up with Sun Ra and I are up,
There we go.
up in space together. As far as you Earthlings talk about time, I do have an album out now.
There we go.
Yes, so I'd like to talk about my current album.
Yeah, let's talk about that. It's really lush and gorgeous and beautiful.
Right.
And you've always had a nice, you want to hold it up for
Yes.
to get a visual thing here?
My current album is New Concepts in Piano Trio Jazz. And it's the trio of myself on piano, Michael Bisio on bass, and Newman Taylor-Baker on drums, which is the Matthew Shipp Trio.
And as a group, and it's been about 10 years for you guys now?
Yeah, I think 9 or 10 years
9 or
since
10 years.
this incarnation of the trio has existed.
Right. So yeah, I was just thinking earlier, because you're a composer.
Right.
You really bring that set of skills, but then you work very much in an improvisatory mode as
Right.
well. And this record seems to really split the hair beautifully on it.
Right. Well, I would say that, going into the recording session, the album was mapped out in my head as far as section. I mean, it's extremely improvisational, extremely.
Right.
But I every section I had very specific directions. I mean, because I didn't really want to do the open form, which we've done in concert a lot, where we actually just start playing. I wanted something very different for this album, and I feel we found. I had very specific instructions. I did not have any music per se written out. I did for one of the sections. I had a basic motif, but I just started playing that for them in the studio and told them to go with it. And my Michael Bisio and Newman Taylor-Baker are both consummate musicians that can pick up on anything and create something out of it. And
But it does seem like if it's tethered in any way, it's through melody.
well, yeah, okay. The instructions I gave in the first section, there is a melody that I had before, but again, I did not give them any music or anything. I just started playing it and told them to, jump in the water and swim. The rest of it, I gave instructions that were textural, somewhat rhythmic, and gestural, meaning that, like, except for going with the open form, let's just, you do this, you do that as a starting point, and keep the concentration. Let's don't just do this for a few seconds and then it goes anywhere. This is the actual kind of concept of the piece. So each section has a very specific textural thing and a specific type of gestural thing it's supposed to get at. And from there, we just went with it. I think the compositional element is that as improvisers, we are all profound. I mean, so we've thought through our language to such an extent that in a completely open form, we can give the illusion that a lot of things are planned because we're just that good at it.
Yeah, it's
I mean, I don't, that might sound egotistical, but it's actually true.
Well, you're talking at least in the we to begin with, because it is three of you. It's imperial but collective at the same time.
I spent my whole career, or life, not career, trying to live out the archetype of the spontaneous composer. I mean, that's an archetype that is out here in the stratosphere, and I'm
Who do you put into the? If we're going to look that up in the dictionary, whose faces do we see?
Okay, well, I would say that's an interesting question. I would say the outline for that archetype is just out here in the stratosphere. I would assume that Baroque and Renaissance composers, to the extent, somebody like Bach did improvisation, as part of the church service as an organist. So I would make the assumption that that archetype existed within the realm of Baroque and maybe Renaissance music. Then classical composers, improvise their own cadenzas at the end. Beethoven did. So that archetype is always out there. Within jazz, I would say, once you get, okay, this is going to be hard. I would say in the 60s and 70s, and not, this is not just about the explosion of free jazz, but as far as, since I'm a pianist, I would say that Cecil Taylor and Keith Jarrett both picked up on that archetype in a way in their solo concerts. Cecil Taylor did a series of solo albums that are exemplary. I mean, Silent Tongues, Air Above Mountains, Indent. There's another one from Japan. I don't remember the name of it, but those were really those were really kind of defined a certain thing at a certain time. And I would say he picked up on the idea of that archetype. Keith Jarrett, in my opinion, attempted to do that in his solo concerts. I'm not a Keith Jarrett fan.
Yeah.
I just actually despise his
Yeah,
work.
okay. It's pretty tough. That's like, there's like that thin line between jazz and jizz,
Well, whatever. I mean, he's obviously an extremely gifted musician, but I'm just not a fan. And he did pick up on that archetype and the way the presentation that he had in the 70s was the attempt to articulate that archetype. But that's an archetype out there, and I consider myself having picked up within the stream of that. And have, as far as like the fine line between improvisation and composition, my life has been an attempt to merge them or to mess up people's perception of them.
Internally, like psychologically for you, since you are a little, OCD.
Right. Which I am, yes.
Yeah, you're on the spectrum somewhere.
I know I'm OCD.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not on the spectrum. You should call my wife if you want to get a full explanation of that.
But
I mean, at least with opening
but
doors,
internally, these things would they present a set of between control and lack of control, right? Or so is this idea of the composer within the improviser, is that just strictly how much you're willing to cede to the moment versus your intuitive thing to like really map ahead of time?
Well, first of all, I mean, music.
Sorry, that was not the most articulate way to put it.
No, but okay, music, you're going from A to Z, right? So how do you get from A to Z? And Z being that you're presenting a listening experience for the audience. So the audience is taking it in. It's just language. I mean, so, they're taking in an end product of something. Now, are you going to sit down and write everything on a paper, or are you just going to pick up an instrument and play? So the craft, I mean, there's a craft to being an improviser that makes coherent statements in real time. There's an extreme craft to that. And as I think I recall a Cecil Taylor quote, him saying something about the energy in a Charlie Parker solo, the short, is equal to anything in European, and so I mean, if I hear a Charlie Parker solo and say it's a 12-bar blues, and I'm struck by the symmetry, the asymmetry, the emotion, the thought, the non-thought, the rationality, the non-rationality of it, but it comes at me as a beautiful product of all of that. Am I going to sit down and say, well, did he write that out on paper? I mean, it's just who cares? I mean, that's
yeah.
So the end product is for the audience is to be hit by language and to take it in and to get something out of it or not get something out of it. And whether you wrote it on paper or not is meaningless. Now, I mean, most people can't just sit at an instrument and play something and get across that craft. That's a lifetime praxis to be able to improvise in real time and get a coherent statement. But with that said in mind, if like say somebody has an attitude about improvisation, I'm sure you've heard like a lot of European scores that by say some 20th century composer that you hear it and I love 20. I'm not saying this in a pejorative sense.
You mean something really modernist and atonal?
But you've heard something that you hear it and you don't like. It's just like, okay, we just went. That's nice that you put all that quote complexity on paper. And then I'm sure you've heard of Charlie.
Like serialism versus like
whatever,
like a riff,
right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've heard some Charlie Parker solo where that was improvised, where if you heard it, it made all the sense in the world to you.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying that like it's great for the grant writers to be able to show them that you went to European 20th century school and you can write something on paper, but who cares at the end of the day? It's music. It's about like language coming at you and you.
But to me, it's more than just about the language. It's in the process, but it's manifest beyond that because it all. You said free jazz earlier.
Right.
Anytime you start using the word free,
right.
freestyling,
right.
like you're a big friend of Jean-Michel Basquiat,
right.
like the kind of free hand.
Right.
When you start talking about that kind of freedom in the creative process, it's entirely different than, in my mind, where you get there. Like it's like, yeah, there's some people who sell millions of records as rappers, but they can't freestyle, and
right.
it's like it's a huge problem for someone like me. Like, right. Really, you're in. It's sort of like if every time I spoke, I was reading something instead of being able to speak extemporaneously. These kind of things I think are fundamental to the way the brain works in organic ways, and I think that you hold on to that a bit.
Well, I think in my music, and I can speak for myself, the way the brain works in organic ways is what my music's about.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's like what I'm about. I'm not even about the idea of like the end. I mean, I am. I make CDs, and this I think is one of the greatest CDs in music history. That's my unabashed.
As I told you, I think it's like 2.0 for you. It's really amazing.
But anyway, I know how the brain works, how the brain processes information. I guess you could put it that way. Is my music is questioning all that, and it's funny you mentioned Basquiat. You were close friends with him. You were like the world's go-to expert about him.
The last one alive.
Right. That when people write articles about him, they call you. I also think what I'm about, and I mean, okay, when I think of him, there's a few things I think about as it relates to me. We were both born in December 1960. That's the first thing. So there's a generational thing. We both love William Burroughs. I've never been I used to be an alcoholic, but I've never been a drug addict. But the whole idea of for me with Burroughs is language as a virus.
Right, that was his thing.
That idea.
As a process, did you like the cut up as a way for him and Geisen and people like that to get to some other less obviously linear way of saying things? Or
I like the cut up, the idea of a cut up. Okay, I'll get to that.
Okay, keep going first.
The next thing with Basquiat and myself is Low by David Bowie is a seminal album for me, and I know that was one of his favorite albums.
Eno produced, which is central to the sounds.
Right. And the kind of that gets into a whole other thing with me, the whole outer space thing. But anyway, the cut-ups. I'm definitely into the splitting up of the components of language to As an actual technique, I don't do like kind of data. I mean, I actually I have. What am I saying? I just lied.
No, well, we're allowed to Stalinize our past. If it didn't come out
Right.
good, you never did it.
Right. I mean, I used to do, and this was for just exercises for myself. I would take like say sections of Schoenberg, sections of a Charlie Parker solo, sections of a Bach fugue, and kind of rewrite them, but all together in a
Nice.
and then I would memorize them myself, and even if it was kind of
It's like analog mashups.
yeah, and I would just for a technical exercise, and I had hundreds of notebooks and stuff I would do, and then I would forget it, but I would memorize. It was just a technical exercise for myself. So
What were the seams like when you're kind of putting Schoenberg in with Charlie Parker or something?
and so I would actually take like maybe little parts from a Ravi Shankar solo.
Oh, nice.
I mean, all kinds of stuff I would put in the
Yeah.
mix. But that was all just for a technical exercise with myself practicing. And the whole idea was I was always trying to get to a language field, because to me, language is all relative. It doesn't, it's all relative. But what I was always trying to get to was the where the language was being gushed, the matrix from where the language was all being gushed to. So all that was just to put my mind in a some type of abstract field of language. So the cut-ups in that case were just basically, I would never do like Nova Express, like some of what Burroughs books are the actual cut.
Yeah, they're not very readable, actually.
Yeah, and they're tough to get through.
Yeah.
I would never do a artistic product of that sort, but as a technical exercise, it was very helpful to me to try. And one thing about people hear somebody like me, they tend to think that you might be very erudite, which I guess I kind of am in music. I do know a lot, but like people tend to read into things, like they see things and they tend to think all of this stuff, whereas you might be kind of and I want to be very careful because I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, and I don't want, or a psychologist, I don't want to use terms, and I'm but like autistic and stuff like that, because I don't know what I'm talking about. But I do, what I do know is that there's people that can touch a language field, and they might not have gotten there through any academic but they might just be open to a field, and then you see their work and you think, because it might touch on a lot of things and they don't sequentially know all those things, they're not as erudite, but they might just be open to a field of language. And I say that in the sense of Jean-Michel, because he was just a sponge for information.
Right.
And he would, I mean, you knew him, which I used to see him out at clubs. I didn't really.
Yeah, but I mean,
he was a sponge for information, and like millions of things are.
And remarkable that way, with his like level of curiosity and engagement, and just the way he processed and the way things and the way it came out. But I do feel, if since we're all generationally the same age, that we could say if there was a common ground, it was that we were all ended up inherently autodidactic.
Right.
Because it was, the information we cared about was not accessible like it is now. We can't just Google something. So there's a whole lot of more word of mouth, a whole lot more kind of intimate sharing of information, which you just got from fellow heads in one way or another. Right. And that's, and just to think of Burroughs that way, he was this sort of like an early crumb for most people on their trail. He's probably more important as a juvenilia, what we care about when we're 15 years old.
Exactly.
Because he's really not rewarding as we're older people. He doesn't have the literary chops to like really sit down in a conversation with great literature. Right. But that's what you're talking about with Jean-Michel is also what I think a process all of us were going through, which was this self-learning, this figuring things out and creating a culture within the hegemonic mainstream culture. Does that make sense?
It makes 100%
Yeah.
sense. Yeah, and I consider myself, even though, like, I had a couple really great classical teachers as a kid, and as far as quote jazz, I studied with Coltrane's teacher and Clifford Brown's teacher, but I basically put the information together myself. I mean, I'm nuts.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think,
And like, if I told you what actually went into the thought process of how I develop my music, you'd be looking at me like, okay, like
no, but like also because some things really can't be taught, and
right,
that's
right,
like, and there's been a real problem with jazz for about 50 years now, towards the academic end of it. That because so many academic people got into jazz, the audience got really nerdy, and a lot of musicians got really nerdy, and it's like great jazz in the most academic sense, but it doesn't really move people as much,
right.
I think. Is that a horrible thing to say?
Well, I'm
We're not saying any names, but I mean,
no.
but jazz needs to resist the academic
Well, I think what
tendencies.
jazz needs are more characters,
Yeah, yeah,
like Sun Ra.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, and people that are a little out there,
yeah.
that don't. I mean, because once jazz to problem to me is like to be strong, it should be to be legitimate. You should be illegitimate, and there's so few people that are willing to be illegitimate,
Yeah, yeah.
and that especially once you start getting college degrees and stuff like that, and angling for other academics that are on grant boards to
That's
give
yeah.
grants out. It's just I mean, it's this language, man. You got to be willing to stick your neck out in the cosmos, let the language flow through you, and then let it go wherever it goes. And then, another thing I really got from Burroughs, though, and I agree with you that you don't really read those books when you're older. That's something that you kind of get inspired by the realm of ideas that he circulated in when you're younger.
Yeah, yeah.
But he has there's stuff in his books about language actually overtaking as a host the human.
Oh yeah,
body.
like Language is a Virus was like a very
Right.
very sexy idea he had in that kind of
Right.
sci-fi light way.
Right. And that idea really affected me when I was very much young. And I got to the point where I was actually, I grew up a very religious person. And I was really influenced by the Christian idea of the Logos, Christ being the Word. And I got to the point where I was actually doing rites to be overtaken, to be possessed by the field of language that I actually articulate on my instrument, because I saw the language as an alive force in the universe. It's like a living group of photons or whatever you want to call it. And that idea of possession of language, or a language actually possess. And I would say to people, like in an abstract, poetic way, if they ask me what my name is, I say, well, I don't really exist. I am that field of language that I articulate on the instrument. You're not really looking at a person. You're actually looking at the field of language.
Well, except you have the weird things of being really religious as a kid. That can no longer be separated. Just to know that
Right.
can't be separated from your path as a composer and a musician. So
No, not at all.
so
I'm,
it's
I'm,
like
I'm a monk. A monk that likes sex.
exactly. And that is a particular type of vows to take.
Right.
It's just all of them without the chastity vow.
Right.
You when you also talk about this other space and stuff, you've mentioned Sun Ra. When you start talking about language, I always think about like Ram LZ and his notion of language and power, or
Right.
or Parliament Funkadelic, things like that. There's this odd, beautiful subgenre of like this Afrofuturism and things like that, which
Right.
has been really interesting and sexy as a strange, aberrant strain within our culture. And I wonder how much you think of Moondog, all those guys like that who kind of got out there.
Right. Well, I
Sun
mean,
Ra especially.
now I think that term Afrofuture, which I'm not exactly sure even what it means. There's kind of people wearing robes and trying to, really.
Well, yeah, it doesn't have to just
Right.
be the Black Panther costumer, but
Right. But as far, I mean, I'm really, to me, Sun Ra unearthed the whole kind of vein that um, is very profound in the music. And I mean, I think he's a figure that had to happen. Like, if it wasn't,
well, and then the whole orchestra. It's like such a collective
right,
energy as well that was
right.
developed there.
And as we are doing this video today, in 5 days, Marshall Allen will be 100 years old.
I know, it's amazing.
So I want to really give a shout out to the beautiful Marshall Allen. But I feel that the whole idea of somebody coming from outer space with a whole language. I mean, the way I interpret the way the archetype works through me is different than the way it works through Sun Ra, and it's a little different like than the way in rock it worked through like David Bowie, whether it's Ziggy or whether it's the figure in the movie. But
A Man Who Fell to Earth.
right, right. But the outlines of that archetype will always be around, and I'm an exponent of it in my particular way. In my way, I don't wear a costume. It's really focused in the idea of logos, this generator of a pure stream of whatever you want to call it, and it's kind of Gnostic, which Sun Ra was, Gnostic definitely.
At least pantheistic, anyway.
Right, and it's an archetype that will always be around. I actually make the claim to be an incarnation an actual incarnation of the archetype. Yeah, if you think I have a Christ complex, maybe I do.
Yeah, there we go.
But I actually make that claim, and my body of work is
mapping that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the ideas behind this kind of outer space, cosmic, shamanic figure, whether you take Bowie or Sun Ra or however, wherever you want to place it, is that it speaks to a degree of alienation as well.
Right.
That it really is the articulation of like, I'm so outside of this. I'm from another planet. Another, yeah. Right. And a lot of people have spoken about how that speaks to like the diaspora of slavery and things like that.
Right.
Because what would most resemble falling from outer space onto this planet than literally being taken out of your culture into a boat and then like sold into a new reality? So,
right.
Is that something you've thought about at all?
Yes, I mean, of course, and I don't. At this point, at 2000, what year are we in?
24.
We are. It's 2024.
Isn't it?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, I think so. No trick questions.
Okay, no, I don't. At this point in my life, and as far as my music and my presentation of myself, I present completely cosmic themes in my. I would just basically tell people if they ask me what my music is about. A, I would say it's about nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Or B, I would say it's not an escapism, but it's a cosmic experience to just take you inside. So to answer your question, I don't deal with any overt themes in that regard. But when I look at my process as a younger person, and especially as it relates to alienation and what I thought about, those things were definitely in my mind.
Yeah.
Okay, let's just put it that way. Yes, that's I guess the best answer to that.
Yeah. yeah, it's interesting to talk about. You say your music's about nothing, which is a nice riddle in there. Uh, I think often about the kind of music that's made in New York that because it's not a place of silence very much.
Right.
It's like sort of, you're hearing your neighbor upstairs while there's somebody playing a radio on the street while maybe some neighbors are fighting in the whatever. It's like, it's this kind of layering of sound that we always get. And I think that has something to do with the music produced here, but so does the silence.
Right.
Right. So I'm just going off of nothingness here, but like, there's Cage's idea of silence.
Right.
And whatever Simon and Garfunkel singing the sounds of
Sounds of
silence.
silence.
I mean, that's a New York song, right?
Right.
So it's like, there's these weird breaks in this record where I felt like I felt silence in there, and which is an odd instrument to wield in music.
Right.
So I was just going to ask you your relationship to silence.
I'm looking for the part of my mind / spirit that dwells in the silence. I mean, that silence is everything to me. And free jazz is what if I'm free jazz, which I don't think I am, but that's the tradition that I'm mainly associated with. Is usually a vortex of sound, a lot of sound coming at you fast. And I'm definitely at this part of my life looking for these spaces of meditative calm in that, and I'm looking for elliptical kind of phrasing that where the brain generates phrases on the instrument that rise from the void, go back into the void, and I'm definitely looking for. I mean, if I had my way about it, I would sit at the piano for a concert, not play anything, and then leave the stage. But I'm a professional musician. If you're getting paid for a concert, you got to play something.
Unless you're John Cage.
Exactly. Yeah, I guess he could.
He did it pretty good. As a matter of fact, people always wanted that song.
Right. I actually did a performance of that for a philosophy class on nothingness once.
Nice.
Right. But so I think that the jazz archetype and the quote jazz avant-garde archetype, despite the fact that they're associated with the rhythm of the city,
right,
does point to that little realm, that pool, or not point. It can go in that direction.
Into that quietude.
Of the quietude, yes. I mean, it can if you choose. I mean, you brought up a very interesting thing. New York has a very peculiar rhythm and a sense of layering. As a lover of early hip hop, I hate most current hip hop, and having to have people come. But I live on the fourth floor of my apartment, so when people go down the street with their car with their hip hop,
yeah, you're in East Village, you hear it.
Yeah, not only do you hear it, sometimes it's
they boom it.
It's booming in your apartment.
Yeah.
I mean, believe me, there's been times where I thought about I just can't take this anymore.
Well, I don't mind necessarily when my neighbors have parties, but sometimes that music they're playing, I just want to throttle them. It's like, Jesus Christ, you're in your 20s and this is the shit you listen to?
Well, I've taken a hammer to the wall.
There we go. This is the New York experience.
Right.
A little low-level rage.
Right. And not only have I taken a hammer, with one neighbor, at one point, I got so upset that I took some Coltrane and Eiler. Not even regular Coltrane,
you went the Albert Eiler route on them. That's
put it up to the wall at full volume.
Yeah.
To get my point across that we're gonna have to come to some truth. But and it's a shame to have to use really great music like that as a weapon. But sometimes in New York,
I think it was some of that stuff was wielded as a weapon at the time. Some of the more discordant. I think like your early work, and I think that like you were always in the jazz scene, but I kind of knew more people in like who were into like indie rock who knew about you than anything
Right.
else. So you always played with a level of like aggression in your music that could be like rock,
Right,
like
right.
that. It was closer to that vernacular in that way to me. I don't
You
know.
mean back in the day?
Yeah, back in the day. I'm talking
Right.
past tense. So
Right.
that's not wrong, right? You were
Well, we did get paid. I mean, there was a time in my life I couldn't get a record deal with a jazz label.
right. So you were like on Homestead, and you were like,
So yeah, but then all of a sudden, like I got a call from Rise Records, which was a punk rock label. I
Yeah.
mean, they had Charles Manson, the eyes on
Oh, yeah,
as
yeah,
their
yeah, yeah.
logo on it.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
I always make the joke that I'm the only jazz album in the world with Charles Manson's eyes on
Oh
it.
yeah, yeah.
And my first record,
And then Henry Rollins had that label. He
Yeah,
put
then
you out. So
Henry Rollins
you were
picked-
loved in that community.
Right.
And what was the connection, or were you just scratching your head going, I don't know, I'm glad
I
they
couldn't
like me.
figure it out back
You couldn't
then.
figure it out.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
was just like, these people like my music, cool.
Yeah.
But that was back in the early 90s. And the interesting thing about that, there was a lot of indie kids that picked up on us, and they quickly educated themselves on about jazz. And I would see like they would be writing the fanzines, and it was actually like really, they weren't just into the fact that it was noisy or anything. They really picked up on the aspects of the lyricism in the music and all that, and a lot of them really got it. And a lot of them went on to actually be like real people in the jazz.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of happened a lot. I mean, certainly like, well, the way Thurston became such a kind of connoisseur of free jazz from Sonic Youth.
Right.
It's, but I don't know. I've always thought that like I can't tell every New York band or every band that's from New York, but I have a sense of it. Like when you talk about like a field of language or something, that the music out of New York's always been, no matter the genre, it's been slightly art damaged over the years.
Right, right.
Like, and I can go, whatever, like that in the '60s when all the whole world was producing all these like garage rock bands and all this stuff like would change the culture. It's like New York produced like the Velvet Underground and the Fugs,
Right.
which between them sold like 20 records.
Right, right.
But if you're going to look for the weird commonality between them, is that they're both weirdly art damaged,
Right,
overly
right.
performative, all this weird things like that. And I can see that through a lot of the stuff that came out of New York.
Right.
Somehow it's like, oh yeah, I don't know if sorry, that's just a tangent, but I don't know if you accept art damage as part of your stream of musical influences and inspirations.
Well, my stream of inspirations are so deep and so varied. Like, okay, go back to Basquiat. Like, boxing is a big inspiration for me.
Uh-huh.
Just yes, sci-fi is a big inspiration to me. Pentecostalism, just idea of speaking in tongues. The whole idea, because
Oh yeah.
no, well, with that, okay, and a poet.
I can see it. I can
Well,
see
not
it.
only that,
Yeah.
okay. I mean, there's a degree in Albert Ayler's music of that also, but I'm always searching for the original language. And if you read the Bible,
Or something which is like proto-linguistic, right?
Right,
Is what
right.
you're trying, because language is more determinative than that. Like, so
Right.
you're, how do you communicate sort of outside of the obvious aspects of language, right?
pre-existence.
Yeah,
I'm pre-existence.
right.
So, but no. I'm going to actually take it back to a biblical thing though. In the Bible, before the Tower of Babel, there was one common language. Then people build a tower and the language is confused because he's mad or it's mad, whatever you want. And then after that, back in the book of Acts, when after the Holy Spirit comes down in Pentecost, they go out and speak, and everybody understands them, no matter what language they spoke. So that's an abstract idea in the Bible, but that idea of some, like, say something that even before the Kabbalah, that there was once a universal language, whatever. I mean, this is just
Well, music would be pretty close to that, you would think.
but I'm even trying to go past that I'm not trying to make the music somehow. If you look at that as a vibrational idea, I'm trying to have the music question what that original language is. So that's an aspirational thing that's happening when I'm playing. It's just an abstract thing that inspires me. So as a young kid that was interested in many forms of Christianity, my parents were Episcopalian, which is very close to Catholicism. So I'm seeing that. My grandmother was Baptist. I had other relatives that were Pentecostal. And I was kind of observing every aspect of that. I went to a Catholic school. Now, these are all completely different manifestations of
Ignorance.
well, you're not. You have a problem with organized religion. These are all completely different manifestations of what Christianity can be. I would keep an open. Have you ever read American Religion by Harold Bloom?
No, I have read Harold Bloom though. He's a good thinker.
It's a great book, and it gets into a lot of things. One thing you could talk about, if you want to say, "Wow, Americans are creative." What if you look at all the forms of Christianity?
Oh yeah, or just whatever, all that stuff.
I mean, look, the Mormons
with their magic underwear,
the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Seventh Day Adventists, Christian Science,
Scientology,
Scientology, and then you can look at Elijah.
But I mean,
you can even look at
Elijah. But you can
Muhammad.
also look at almost anything in the Old Testament and go like, really, you believe that shit?
Well, it's not a matter of that. Okay,
it's all magical thinking. It's like
no, I'm not gonna.
It's an act of faith. So
I
leave
mean,
it at
science
that.
is I'm not going. I'm not going to get into.
You don't have to defend your religion.
I'm going to just say that some form of spirituality is necessary for humans to feel their place in the and that spirituality could be listening to music. It could be like afterglow after an orgasm,
Right.
I mean, it could be whatever. But I'm just saying, within the vernacular of religious ideas, there's a lot of poetic ideas that are beautiful, and they come from some invisible source. I mean, the idea of love.
What Burroughs meant when he said language is a virus, he's saying it comes from the language. It's the nature of language.
Right.
But you're giving it like this spiritual thing.
Okay,
no, it's like it's constructed within language.
Yes, but I'm further abstracting the word language to go past like actual like discursive like something that to being like a vibrational kind of essence of DNA or of some sort of spiritual DNA, and then then language as a discursive force is something that comes later in the chain. But I'm using the term in a very broad kind of vibrational sense, as it relates to me trying to generate an album, like my album that everybody should buy because it's great. But so I'm talking in terms of I mean, why is the word for Christ in Greek the word? Why is the word seen as
why is that a heavier question than why we use the word blue for this pants?
Well, I'm all the questions come out of the same Big Bang.
Oh yeah.
So I'm not putting anything in a hierarchy. I'm just saying that I use the word language in a very, very broad vibrational sense.
Yeah. Interesting. Very good. Where do we want to go with this now? We've already. How do we claw back to reality?
Well, I want to bring in something, and this is since we both are kind of. I don't want to. I mean, historians of the Lower East Side. I mean, we've both been there for a while. We both have deeply imbibed the culture. The culture of the Lower East Side is so deep. I mean, we can start from the roots of all the races that have, like Ukrainians and
we were the actual sweet spot of the melting pot. We're like literally. It was the immigrant community where everyone was kind of warehoused. So it has the most of that, the kind of the most history.
Right. but then, we get to all the artistic people that we both have now. Like, you know, we're close with John Michelle, who I used to see out,
Right.
and I know a lot of people
No,
in
it's a
his
lot of,
circle. But then, like, I was really close to poets like John Ferris and Steve Cannon.
yeah,
And
amazing.
then, but let's get to this cat that lived on 10th Street between 9th and 10th on Avenue B that obviously we didn't know because he died before we were born. But like Charlie Parker
Right.
lived in the Lower East Side. Who to me, Charlie Parker is one in a as far as like the cosmos or the earth.
Yeah.
He's
We're all his children.
yeah. I actually said in an essay, and hopefully it'll be come out in a book that is being shopped around right now, or there's a couple people that want to do it, but it just hasn't worked out. I have one essay in the book, because the book is, I have a lot of stuff that's been online and different, but it's kind of a compilation. But there's some essays that have never been printed, and one is on the Lower East Side, and the 80s specifically. But I was talking about the language, and I made the point that all the kind of bohemian youth that come to the neighborhood, in a sense, are the spiritual child of Charlie Parker and William Burroughs. They might not even know who those people are, but they're kind of like
I mean, there's a lot of interesting figureheads in there. I mean,
Right.
some, most notorious Marxists and revolutionaries used to
Right.
live in the neighborhood, and
Right.
it was I don't know if tolerance is the right word, but a lot of things were allowed in the East Village, Lower East Side, historically, that weren't allowed other places.
Right. Right.
So a lot of mixed race couples could be more
Right.
comfortably seated at a restaurant or a bar,
Oh,
and
nobody
that
would-
makes a huge difference.
Yeah,
Like to have that as a character of the neighborhood, that
Right.
that lesbians could open the Little Red Schoolhouse,
Right,
which
right,
is
right.
like now a really fancy private school in the West Village, but that was a alternative educational thing of the or Emma Goldman,
Right.
but,
Right. Right.
so it's
Right.
pretty
Right. Yeah. No, the
pretty
history
deep history.
is so deep.
And then punk rock, I think,
Right.
was super important. when it
Hardcore.
came- Hardcore, I thought hardcore was a suburban movement.
Well, it was,
we
but
had some hardcore bands, but
how it-
punk, New
Right,
York,
right.
kind of helped invent. So,
Right, right.
And so there's certain things that are really truly New York vernaculars.
Right, right.
Like more so than jazz, is like punk and hip hop
Right, right.
really are New York.
Right. But with Charlie Parker, man, I mean, there's no phenomenon I can think of in Western civilization like Charlie Parker. That original wave of bebop is something that happened in that one little slice, and then I don't know if the conditions are ever there, because there's something completely just different.
Well, it was really heady, and I'm curious for you, like, because as you say, like you're grasping at the this elusive spiritual in your music, but you're also like pretty intellectual with your music in the same way that like bebop was. It was much smarter than
Right.
big band. It was like so. I'm just curious for you, like between kind of the rational thought and the gut emotion, like
Right.
where
Well,
you land.
I mean, when I think of Charlie Parker, I think of the phrase. I mean, he is the master of kind of breath, timbre, the rhythmic propensity of what constitutes a musical thought coming together in an experience that's condensed. And when you hear him, it's not even kind of music. It's not even music in a way. It's actual like thought process.
Phrasing and some
Just being almost like a pure African talking drum, but within Western harmony maybe. But at the same time, where to do what he did takes such an understanding of Western harmony. It exists in a stratosphere outside of all of that too. There's something about the original wave of bebop that couldn't be done without a very sophisticated understanding of Western music, but yet it exists in a sphere that is almost, I use the word uncivilized because racism. You think of Western.
Right.
Yeah, but it's almost it's civilized in the sense that it exists in.
I like culture is a better term than civilization.
Right.
So we could talk about what's kind of uncultured.
Right.
You know.
Well, and I don't mean. I mean, I say that only because it actually to me is elevated above it.
Yeah.
It's just like how are the conditions of that original powerful wave were even set? I can't think of anything in world music that has the properties that and the purity that original wave had. And I don't, they couldn't sustain it for that long. I mean, Charlie Parker got, left the planet.
Yeah.
They couldn't even sustain.
Yeah.
Now you did you ever talk to Basquiat about his love for Charlie Parker? Because that's to me, I get the sense that was Charlie Parker was his biggest.
Oh, totally. If you look at that painting CPKR, Charlie Parker, he gets so much right. I mean, he gets the Stanhope Hotel. I think he gets the day slightly wrong, but he gets all this stuff, and it's sort of like, as we said, this is the autodidact in the era before the internet.
Right.
And like he kind of pieces together a story of Parker's life and particularly his death. That's really pretty fucking esoteric. So
right.
that kind of that kind of representing is really deep. And I think if you're going to think in relation to Jean-Michel, that you should keep in mind that his actual, musical tastes from the beginning was noise music.
Right,
he liked
right.
Einstürzen, Neubauten and stuff like that. And then that bebop in particular, jazz kind of as a species, as a whole, is sort of like the church.
Right,
it's sort of like you go back to church at a certain point.
Right.
And so when you see like Jean-Michel, like he really just dives into it.
Right.
And he's learning as he's painting.
Right.
And so it's like becomes his diary of discovery.
Right.
And that's what kind of makes it really alive.
Right. Do you what degree do you feel he the dope as far as like and Charlie Parker as a martyr?
Right. Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when you think of the pantheon of the Lower East Side, there was always a lot of that, and Jean-Michel's now part of that.
Right.
That dangerous mythology. But before, it used to be like every kid who wanted to be a great guitarist like Johnny Thunders had to shoot smack, and like every fucking band out of the Lower East Side was like all of a sudden junkies because of these kind of these mythologies.
Right.
It's where is like the Kubla Khan strain in literature? What is this opiated days, and how do people, and how does it work so well with so many artists?
Right.
Until it stops working.
Until it stops.
But it is this kind of the opiated dream is a really interesting headspace for people creatively. So
yeah, no, it is. And as somebody that I was around heroin constantly, from older jazz musicians to, I used to hang out, as in the club scene, just for my social life, at the Pyramid and places, and I was around people doing heroin all the time, and a lot of my idols were. But I had never had any inclination to go to drugs. I used to be an alcoholic, but I always could, I don't want to say romanticize, but get into the how dope inspired Burroughs and some other people, because he actually took it and made something of it. It wasn't just that he was on it and wrote. He actually
wrote about it.
Wrote about it and wrote about it, abstracted from it other things. I always could distance, and I always knew that I can't this shit is a dead end. Like you can't, you can't do it. To stay away from it.
Well, you end up losing a lot of years.
Yeah, yeah. I was hanging out with people that were.
But we know, we do know ex-junkies. Some do survive.
Yeah, no, a lot survive. I mean,
yeah.
I have a lot of friends and people that went through that period, got out of it, and are stronger because of it.
I mean, I think one of the weird myths I've seen is, there's a lot of really destructive notions around creativity. The big one, and one that, there's like a movie like Basquiat is really guilty of, is like, and all of Julian's movies are horrible this way. The suffering artist, the crazy artist, the junkie artist, whatever, all of his things, right? Like,
Right. Well,
every Schnabel movie's like somebody, oh my God, so you're a poet and you got AIDS and you're whatever. It's like, it's endless with him.
I haven't
It's
seen
like
that movie for
Van
years.
Gogh or whatever.
Right.
It's a tyranny of cliches.
Right.
But what people don't understand with the alcoholism that a lot of the action painters had to deal with, shall we say, or all the artists who were doing way too much blow and in a self-indulgent way in the 80s, or the junkies and stuff, is that no one was doing it to be extra decadent.
Right.
Literally everyone all those artists I can think about were doing it for their art. They were doing it for their work. Yeah, eventually it takes over your life and you can't do anything without it. But a lot of the usage wasn't like as based in nightlife as you would think. It was based in like studio practice.
Right.
Anyway, sorry to go off on it,
Well,
but I do think people misunderstand why artists take drugs.
Right. I'm lucky I never got.
Yeah.
Because I was around this.
Well, especially if you were an alcoholic, so
Right.
you got an addictive personality, so that's no good.
Right. I was around.
And I got to say, I never minded the company of junkies half as much as I did of drunks.
I was around a lot of junkies who, some of our favorite jazz musicians.
Yeah, no, and generally nice people, like
the
junkies, maybe they're dishonest or some things like that.
Well, and some of them would steal stuff.
If they're poor, then they'll, but like generally they're way better behaved than
alcoholics.
And that's why I like potheads best of all.
Right. But anyway, Charlie Parker is deep. I don't think.
Now, I've always had this thought, but it's not really one I could ever write or really do much of. I shouldn't even say it on camera. But I thought that 5 Spot, Sluggos, the jazz scene of the East Village, Lower East Side was one thing. And then also, like, because you mentioned John Ferris earlier, Steve Cannon, that something happened. There was a different set of decisions went into the African American community that moved downtown.
Right. Well,
and that Harlem was sort of like an intellectual and mostly political center for Black culture, and that the ones who moved to our neighborhood did so for slightly different, or to get away from that a bit. Is that all right to say?
Well, first of all,
school me.
No, I'm not gonna. I'm friends with a lot of the people. Like, for instance, the visual artist David Hammonds.
David Hammonds, who does live uptown, but spent a lot of time downtown.
He did his hang time downtown.
Yeah.
I was very close to him. And there's a lot of. I don't know if like the painter Joe Overstreet ever lived in Harlem. Did he ever?
No, he was always downtown.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
But a lot of the people.
Ken Kaliba House, which is still there.
A lot of people of that generation. I was very close to John Ferris. I was, Steve Cannon, very close. You actually brought this up to me before, and your exact words were, "I'm not equipped to write. This would be."
Well, yeah, it's like,
and you said
about like kind of And you said, let me just colonialize that experience here.
And you said, it would be very interesting to see why people that were in Harlem actually hung out in the Lower East Side and came down.
Yeah. And
you brought up the question of whether they were trying to get away from a Black nationalist thing that might have existed.
Yeah.
I'm friends with a lot of these people, and I'm not going to speak to that, and I'm going to let.
Well, I can't speak for any of their
I'm going to
experiences.
let a later academic
Yeah,
who do that term paper. I know what a lot of people said to me. I know various motivations, and whether it's social, whether it's business, whether it's a girlfriend that is
Right.
supporting you, whatever, whatever within a very,
So they were all individuated reasons for sure.
yeah. I mean, let's put it this way. Bohemia has a way of having some universal motifs that, I do think. I mean, John Ferris is a really interesting case because he was around Malcolm X.
Right. He worked as a bodyguard for
Yeah,
Malcolm.
he was actually around. And
Until like the day he got shot, basically.
Well, yeah.
It was just when he moved downtown.
Well, and he's very interesting because also if somebody, John, if you approach them about being a black poet, they look at you like, what? He's just a poet.
Right.
Yeah. And so I'm not going to speak for that generation, they were all friends of mine, but I'm a different generation, and even though they understand me and I understand them, their experience and my experience is a lot different.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Because I grew up with integration, and it's just a slightly different. I'm going to agree with you that it's a very interesting.
There's a story. There's a story there. It's not ours to tell.
I'm not equipped to talk about that, even though they're my friends, and I'm black. I'm still not equipped to talk about that move, especially for somebody that lived in Harlem and then spent their time in the Lower East Side. That story, and unfortunately, most of them are dead or
yeah, we've lost most of that generation now.
So to actually really sit them down and get that flowing is going to be hard. But there's people that were of their generation that knew them that could possibly speak to that better.
Yeah. I mean, it's not vital to the culture.
Well, no, it's a very.
But it's an interesting aspect of our neighborhood. I think
very interesting, and I could, discretion. There's a lot of things I could speak about that I'm not going to.
Yeah.
For a video for public consumption.
That's true.
But
let's not get canceled.
Well, I could speak to a lot of things as far as these people's attitudes about certain aspects of racial things, about things dealing with, sexuality and where they ended up in the spectrum of who they were going out with and stuff. There's a lot, and again, stuff like that, everything's in the mix as far as what makes motivations and things happen. So
RuPaul's another one from our neighborhood, right? So
he ended up there from
that was his
from Atlanta. I guess, but from what I hear, RuPaul is definitely a part of the pyramid. Situation. That's a whole different thing than the black artist.
No, I know. I just meant like when you brought that up. But I wanted to ask you a little bit while we still have some time, because you have spoken so much about language. And then I'm more likely to talk about a poet with you than I am about a record. I mean, your level of interest and basic love for the poetry scene, which doesn't have a lot of love out there.
Right. Hardly any.
Hardly any. It's like and yeah, you've cared so much about it. Some of your closest collaborators, some of
my closest friends,
right. Do come from that world. So how does it, why is it so fundamental? Why does it speak to you so clearly when most people don't investigate poetry as much?
Very interesting. I have no idea. Other than, first of all, I just talk about, I've been very close to a few. Like my best friend was this guy, Lester Affleck, who died in 2000. I think it was 2000, the year. And he was black poet. He was definitely not, he was kind of I guess you could say he was romantic. in his and then I was very close to John Ferris.
Right. Great poet, great artist.
Great poet who, could be a difficult person.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And there's a whole mythology.
Yeah.
Now, since he,
especially if he was drinking.
right, yeah, there's a whole mythology between his curmudgeon nature. I mean, in a good sense. There's a whole mythology since he passed away about that. I've seen some stuff 3 or 4 in the morning hanging out with John that could curl your hair.
Yeah.
I was very, very close with Steve Delachinsky, who is a quintessential New York figure who lived in Soho, and he used to sell books and stuff on the street, and
this is also when to circle back on it, but when we're talking about the kind of how we all went from clueless kids to kind of like, hipsters or whatever, was this kind of self-education.
Right.
And actually a guy selling really cool books on the street could be kind of fundamental to lots of people learning about lots of different things.
Not only that, but Basquiat, because you brought that up.
Yeah.
Basquiat used to go to Steve to get information on what albums to buy.
Yeah.
Steve, a couple of weeks before Basquiat died, I think he got him this Coleman Hawken album that, and Yuko, Steve's wife, Yuko Otoma, who's a great poet and painter herself, often talks about how Steve never comes up in Basquiat, the idea of Basquiat's education about jazz, because he used to get albums from Steve. But anyway, Steve Delachinsky, who did a lot of liner notes for me, in his poetic style, especially my Rogue Art albums, which.
Oh, we should talk about that book.
Yes,
a bit.
There's a great book on my Rogue Art, which we'll get to that. But Steve Delachinsky was very close to me, and I think I was inspired by the fact that Cecil Taylor was a poet also, and Robert Duncan and people like that were people I remember him talking about. It's just always to me seems such a natural. Because to me, poetry is about phrasing and breath and stuff. It's just, and I'm always going for in my music, I'm looking for the ultimate
purest
phrase. If people hear that one phrase, it'll arrest their brain and and we'll go back to some pure heaven. I'm looking for that phrase that has so much power, which is maybe my love for Charlie Parker, also. But that's
for me with language, it's like I always think about style.
Right.
Because a lot of people can explain things pretty clearly or pretty well, but a little bit of style goes a long way, and I see a lot of writing lacking style. I mean, as an art writer, we're our lineage is littered with the bodies of poets. For New York, if you think about the whole New York school, start with Frank O'Hara.
Right.
Then John Ashbery, and we just lost Peter Sheldall. And John Yao is still out there, but most of the poet writers are gone. And I always laugh about it because writing about art is a vow of poverty, but for the poets it was a good payday. So
how low can we get?
Knowing how low I am on the food chain, I always love the poets just for being a little more pathetic than me.
That's funny, man. Oh my God. Anyway, well, jazz musician.
We also had a special radar for them working in the clubs because God forbid the booking agent thought it'd be a good idea to have poetry one night. Doesn't matter how off the hour is. The poor bartenders are serving 30 waters with not even $1 tip between them. It's just the cheapest bunch of bastards on the planet.
Oh my God!
Sorry, I don't know where that came from. Sorry.
Right.
No, but it is interesting that you've really found some common language with poets. I think.
Well, I mean, I don't. I'm interested in everything. Mm-hmm. To me, everything is language. Everything is. There's a reason for it, and I'm always curious as to why people do things and what is the phenomenon. Trying to look at it with a non-judgmental mind, even though I'm going to be judgmental,
Right.
but just trying to see it for what it is. And I guess one thing I'm not that poetry that I'm not enthused about with poetry is the poverty.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
But that's
like
that's
yeah, we're bohemian, but like
we're Bohemian.
we're
but
way more bourgeois than that.
Yeah, we're sensible Bohemians.
I think for poets, I guess success is when you get the academic job. Is
Right.
basically
Well, that's
most of American poet laureates teach some.
it's
some
come
school.
that way in jazz too. I mean, if you look at most jazz musicians, a lot, or I can't talk for
Right.
a lot of jazz musicians. It seems to me that the two things that they're angling for is an academic position at a decent college and a MacArthur grant or something like that. And so that's what it seems. I'm one of the few crazy. I'm a crazy, so I'm out here trying to be like a romantic poet in the same way Chopin was.
No. To do these things without institutional support does take when we don't go for the teaching job. It's a lot of. I think there's a lot of hidden sacrifices within that that people don't always acknowledge. That the people who really go off and do it on their own without like that serious kind of endowed support, it's a much harder road to hoe. But we have like our afternoons free to sit around and bullshit in front of a camera
like this, right?
It's like.
Right. Well, I mean, for me, when I had a talk with William Parker, the great bassist, and William, is we were talking about this the other day, and he just said, "Well, who do we like?" And I said, "Oh, we like, Charlie Parker, we like John Coltrane, we like McCoy Tyner, we like Albert Ayler, we like," and he's like, "Yeah, where did any of them get their degrees from?" We're like, "They don't have degrees."
Yeah, it's definitely self-taught.
And that's the lineage I dropped out of college. I'm not, if people need to get a degree to make a living, great. You should do that. I'm not advocating what anybody should do. I can only talk for myself. This is a religious calling for me. My authority to do, and again, I hope I don't have a Christ complex, or I do actually. But in the Bible, they ask Christ, the rabbis, they were asked, like, where do you get the authority to say this? And he's, from my Father in heaven. So my authority to do what I do comes from the language. If you want to look at the language field as a Godhead, this shit was just put in my head by angels. However you define an angel, a holographic energy form, whatever. My call comes from the universe. I don't need a college degree. I don't, and I don't have any. I don't put any pride. I went to Harvard or Yale or anything. That shit is meaningless to me. The language flows through me. I sit at an instrument and I articulate it. That's where it starts. That's where it ends.
Do you think for what you're doing, this is a really ridiculous hypothetical, but like that if you'd gone to like Berkeley School of Music or something.
Well, I did go to Newman Conservatory. I didn't graduate.
Right. Okay. So but there's a certain amount of unlearning has to go into this.
Oh, completely. I mean,
so talk about that. How did you unlearn?
I'm nuts. Again, the premise that I base a lot of stuff off, if I told people how my mind operated, they would be like, whoa. Okay. I just like, I'm naive. I'm both, I'm lucky enough to both be extremely naive and also to be kind of erudite in some ways. So whatever, I pushed at the extremes of both, and I was willing to go out on a limb in a lot of ways on things, and I just premised how I process information on premises that a lot of people would just never do. So if you see me as unique, that's why. And I just never cared. I just don't. I guess what for whatever reasons, that independence of thought in a certain way was just fostered, and I really don't care. I mean, I don't, you know,
Well, you talk about like kind of questioning. So anytime you're dealing with a level of interrogation in the work itself, you know, it means you've got a kind of contrary way of taking
right,
the
right.
received. This is the way it's done.
Right.
So you're
Well,
going to
and
find
also,
something different.
I for whatever reason, I had a mystical experience my first year of college because I went to University of Delaware for a couple of years. I didn't go to class. The only classes I had a good piano teacher there, so went to my lessons, but the rest of the class, like, you know, I stayed in the dorm and practice all day.
Right.
It's just garbage. But I did, like, my sociology class I kept, and I had this mystical experience reading my sociology book where I saw every aspect of culture being completely, like, just a construct that happened by accident because people agreed. And so everything is,
It's a consensus.
yeah, as a consensus. And I remember seeing, so I from an early age, you know, everything to me is like illusionary. Everything is illusionary. So therefore, like, I don't want to fit into anybody's anything, you know, unless it serves me and my imagination.
Yeah, I mean, you said unique. That's a word that always it's a trigger word for me. This record, it's like new concepts. It's like it sounds so modernist.
Right, right.
No one uses new anymore unless they're talking about like a detergent or something. So you know, we're postmodern enough that we don't even think that way. And so for me, like when I think like, why is my friend Matt so different? I think of hybridity actually.
Right, right.
And that like because you are thinking of like, you know, we're not scientists, as you say, in our ignorant ways, but you're thinking about like science and you're thinking about theology
Right.
or spirituality, or you're thinking about math to some degree.
Right,
There's
right.
a lot of your stuff, I think, we didn't even get into it, is like, you talk about how Bach could get to a certain place playing
Right.
the organ, doodling on an organ in a
Right.
church is like, that's math.
Right,
also.
exactly.
Right,
Exactly.
so when you talk about the Baroque in that way. But so that I also think that like we talked about how you had a rock audience as a jazz musician, or that like you've been developing like the imaginary endless Borgesian playlist for a club, the Pyramid Lounge, that doesn't even exist anymore.
Right.
So like that your musical influence, that all these things are coming from really different places.
Right, right.
And it's not that they're mixing; it's just that they're hybridizing.
No,
which is
they're
really
not. I
different.
mean, they're
You
different.
chew your food too well.
Yeah, they're different things fucking each other,
Yeah.
creating offspring. You know.
Yeah, yeah.
They're not. They're not. Yeah, I'm not. I'm not interested in a combination of this. I'm interested in existing, and if you exist, just millions of things go through your central nervous system. So, you know, I mean, like you eat different things, but like, you know, my body is not the broccoli I ate
Right.
yesterday. Is, you know. So,
But in terms of your diet, I do have to think that the pyramid's an odd one because of all the different genres you've kind of swum in over the years. You haven't really done dance music, and that was very much like
that was
you
a
know,
dance club, yeah.
That was a dance club, and it's like it wasn't stuck by one genre. It wasn't like disco or, you know, EDM or anything like that, or funk, or it was all of them as could make somebody get off their ass and dance.
right. Well, to anybody watching this video that doesn't know what the Pyramid was, it was a very iconic dance club in New York in the early '80s, and it started in the early '80s.
Yeah.
And I used to, when I moved to New York in the early '80s, I used to go out dancing every night, mainly because it took me a few years to get a career. I wasn't touring or anything until like '89 or '90. So from like 83, 84 to 88, you know, I was going out every night to discos, to dance clubs in New York, just socially to meet people and my peers. And the Pyramid was a club. That sensibility actually influenced. I mean, first of all, I felt at home in New York among that group of people, maybe more than any group of people I've ever been in. You know, I mean, I've seen the Pyramid described. There's a new book out about the Pyramid called "We Started a Nightclub," and there's a couple quotes. I think Brian has a quote, or maybe about misfits from all over.
Yeah.
And
I think it was a community of people who would basically, a lot of people, especially because a huge part of the demographic was gay.
right.
So there's a lot of people who had actually literally left wherever they were in America because they were ostracized. They were kind of and then they all found their community of
Right.
a shared difference.
Right. Well, yeah. Also, I wanted to get that part of somebody that doesn't know what the pyramid was. It became an iconic spot for drag queen performances too, and it's a very specific type of drag performance because it wasn't the usual West Village type.
Right. So I mean, I remember like, God, the place had been open a month or two, and it was all like, we're going over, and it was like to the mine shaft or something because it was already like as AIDS is scratching its fingernails deep into the surface of the culture, like things started to change, and so you'd have some of these clubs where like all of a sudden like we're going to do like a Sunday tea where with drag acts, but like it would be the West Village ones would be like, okay, there's your Judy Garland, and there's your Liza Minnelli, and there's your Patsy Cline, and then like we all went over en masse with one of the early figures, somebody who died, was Tanya Ransom, and she did like Nina Hagen instead. Right. So I feel like what the pyramid was on top of the place where Nirvana played when they played New York or whatever, it's got like lots of important histories, is it was kind of the birth of queer culture instead of like gay.
Right.
It's like,
exactly.
It's like queer as in like we're not gay as in happy, we're queer as in fuck you.
Yeah, exactly. And the pyramid also had a very strong heterosexual
thing going on. They allowed people like us.
It was a really deep place, man. It was a lot. It was a very dense. There was a lot going on,
Yeah.
But it was a great
like a lot. It was a home for performance art, which is like
right.
I mean, how much the problem with performance art is it like gets to be so frontal, so polite, so cultured with a capital C, it loses all its edge. This is like people like Karen Finley or Ethel Eichelberger or like a generation of performance artists are getting in front of a room full of people who are really inebriated or intoxicated in some way, and they just want to either dance or, more importantly, get laid. And how do you command that kind of attention? How does Lydia Lunch perform to that room? And it was so much like just grabbing people like and shaking them.
Right.
It was like such a more dynamic version of performance art. And a lot of things. Anyway, sorry.
Well, that was the great thing about the pyramid. You go there to dance, but then there'd be these performances and drag
totally
shows.
Disruptive, and people
disruptive.
dancing on the bar. It's like
right, but it was a whole culture in and of itself, and it was a vortex of all kinds of stuff coming together, and it was like whoa, and I mean, of course.
But also when you talk, like you mentioned Brian Butterick was really one of the surviving founder, because Bobby Bradley and Ann Craig and all the early ones, they all died really young. But Brian was, as creative director, the one who kind of continues all the years and defines the place the most. I forget where I was going to go with that. Finally, a senior moment after all this talking.
No, Brian was a visionary.
Yeah, he really was. I forget why I was citing him though. It was just a really different energy. I always think of like at the same time there was this group FAFH, like kind of like a radical group, but it stood for like Fags Against Facial Hair.
Right.
So like Keith Haring was a part of that, stuff like that. And there was this big thing, like kind of right by Astor Place in the East Village on a wall, like clones go home.
Right.
So that really like it was something in the water that was so different and so aberrant. I always felt like the East Village, like our neighborhoods, always things happen there that probably happen other places, but when they grow out of this really fertile, really fecund soil of the East Village, they kind of become a wilder set of weeds than the manicured lawns you get elsewhere.
Right. Well, I felt so at home at the pyramid, and it's not because like people listen to free jazz. I mean, it was just because it was just a kind of this open thing, and I don't want to say anything was accepted, but I'm having trouble articulating exactly why I felt at home. It's not because I'm a freak and a misfit, because I'm.
Well, you are. just in case you're confused about that, let's put your those
William
fears to
Parker
bed.
always says that when I say I'm sane, and he just looks at me and he goes,
Yeah.
"You really think so? Really?" But
You're
no.
functional, but you're not sane.
Okay, yes. We have a mutual. Well, never mind. I was going to say a mutual, but I'm not going to get into that. I did a Facebook post once about how I was way more inspired by watching the drag queens that danced on the bar at the pyramid than I was from any cliche in a jazz magazine you ever see. I don't know. There's something about the culture there, that I just felt so at home about it. And I guess I can't put my words on it. I love 80s dance music, though.
Right.
And I love the whole culture of that, how dance was in the 80s in New York, which is, if you read was Tim Lawrence's book,
Yeah. The last night the DJ saved my life.
No, the other one about
Love
the
Saves the
dance
Day?
floor, New York dance,
Life. What is it? Life and Death on the New York Dance
New York
Floor.
dance floor,
Yeah, sorry.
yeah, which is a Bible. That's
It's a great one. The one he does on the earlier era,
Right.
Love Saves the Day, is really great also.
But there's parts of that book where he talks about kind of the apotheosis of the overall feeling on the dance floor in certain clubs. If I recall, I could get this wrong, but he might have been talking about that in the Saint, which is a club I never went in.
Right.
Which, if you were...
Well, now, I mean, Tim's such a great writer, you forget that he wasn't even alive.
He wasn't even there.
He wasn't in New York
Right.
or alive during any of this stuff. He just does a remarkable job with his books.
Right. That is a remarkable
one
book.
of the things, like, why you probably like the 80s dance book, the DJ one, is versus maybe what he gets at is the mix.
Right.
And I think that this is something that's like, I was a doorman at clubs. I wasn't a DJ or a bartender, but just like bartenders need to mix drinks, DJs really needed to mix music back then. We were kind of adjacent to, but off the scale of urban dance mixing, which was about matching beats and all this stuff like that gets really hegemonic and really quite redundant. So the idea would be, like, if you could put a 60s group getting you to do the shag next to some krautrock early electro next to classic full-on disco diva, and kind of make those things like seamless but jagged.
Right.
That was the kind of mix that we were going for. And as a door person, it was the same thing. It's like, you could be in there, but the great thing about having, for instance, a huge percentage of queer people in your bar is it makes most heterosexual men really uncomfortable. Right? So they don't act out in weird ways. Right? Like you could get like the biggest drunkenest group of groping bros, but you throw them in a room where like half the people are queer, they will not grab one of those.
Which
hot
is
girls.
Interesting, because in the weekends at the pyramid, you had the bridge and tunnel crowd.
Yeah. Well, at the end, it's like it all changes. But
Right.
I talk about clubs in their ideal state. Every club was a shit show at a certain point in the night.
Oh God! But I felt so, and I just want to mention this book.
Yeah, let's talk about
Singularity Codex, by Clifford Allen, a tremendous writer. And this book is about my CDs on a French label called Rogart. It's specific because I did about 20. I lost count, 20 or 20 some CDs on that label. But in this book, actually, Clifford gets into a lot of sociology about the Lower East Side, even things about real estate and stuff. He gets pretty deep into that, and this book gets into a lot of things, because there's a lot of things within my realm of music, that, if you want to call it the jazz avant-garde, that kind of was centralized or got started in the Lower East Side.
Or a lot of it downtown, Tribeca, also.
Right.
The loft jazz scene, you mean, maybe a little bit?
Right.
Yeah.
So this is a tremendous book that gets into, it's about me and my albums, but it goes way beyond me, and it gets into, which is the magic of the book, because I'm boring. but it gets into a lot of stuff that's way beyond me, and it's masterfully done by Clifford.
Yeah.
You
I've
did
read
a
it.
panel with
Yeah,
us
yeah,
before.
yeah. No, it's really good, and there are some really interesting things. I mean, I've never even really. It's before your time, but I'm sure the vestiges of the loft jazz scene was downtown was you would encountered many of the people from
Well,
that.
not only
Well,
that,
I think Phil
but
Niblock just died, but
yeah,
he
he
was
died.
like
Right, right.
uh,
But William Parker, who is a big part of
right,
my life and I
yeah,
played with a lot, you know, he came in at the end of this of the loft scene and was involved with Sam Rivers and some of the stuff towards the end of that thing. So that ethos obviously led or informed the Arts for Arts, which is the organization that puts the Vision Festival together,
right.
and you know is a big part of the whole community aspect of the music as you know. So yeah, this is all. New York is so deep, man. I mean, it's just so much.
And then what's kind of concurrent with that, like, because we have Fluxus is also
Right,
part
right.
of that, and Yoko doing concerts and things
Right,
like that.
and that's Tribeca.
Yeah, and one of the things just as a weird landmark is like, because we try to figure out what does downtown mean,
Right.
and really the first ways I start seeing downtown used as a kind of an adjective for kind of culture is actually John Cage.
Right.
Because John Cage is a famous composer who's doing things at Carnegie Hall, but then he's coming downtown and doing these things in the loft scenes and
Right.
stuff like that. And so the New York Times would literally distinguish like John Cage uptown and John Cage downtown, and you'd read these reviews,
Right.
like because he was always written about in the Times,
Right, right.
And one of them would be like, yeah, this is his downtown show, and
Right.
they'd be really specific about that, which is, to me, lays out a different kind of topography.
Right, right. Well, yeah, I mean the history in our name, and if you want to add Tribeca and the West Village.
Yeah, well, downtown. Downtown
yeah.
as a whole.
Right, right.
I mean, then East Village has another weird thing. I find it weird that, like, I mean, it becomes a real estate term, really, right? It's like,
Right.
it's carving out a piece of the Lower East Side and naming it kind of like the West Village, which is a more, appealing and expensive piece of property. So it had functioned that way, but when Bob Rauschenberg kind of moves from the Roost, where they're all like the macho guys fighting at the Cedar Bar or something like that, and he opens a studio. He's got the one which is the old bank, and then he's got the one on Lafayette there. It's like that's when they go like, oh, we've got these new artists in the East Village.
Right.
So it's like, it's weird how like these things which ultimately become about finance and real estate and stuff like that, a lot of them start actually in the cultural coverage in the
Right,
press.
right.
Sorry for that tangent.
Well, no, but this is all interconnected. I mean,
Yeah.
it's all interconnected. So I just feel that, when I think of all the people that came through the East Village in the jazz, I mean, not every, a lot of
Yeah.
people have lived there at some point. And Sun Ra used to play at
Sun Ra,
Slugs.
it's Slugs, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's just, it's mind blowing.
And also a lot at the 5-spot, and
Right.
especially when the 5-spot moved to location right on St. Mark's.
Right.
It was like, that's when like Sun Ra would do like 2-week long residencies there and
Right,
stuff
right.
like that. The kind of the bitter end but when if you start getting into the old artists from the neighborhood and stuff like that, the ones who are still alive, you ask them, where'd you hang out? They all hung out at the 5-spot.
Right,
All
right.
the artists
Right,
did.
right, right. Yeah. Beautiful. So
All right, is that good for now?
I am jazzed out.
Yeah, we're good. You're gonna have to edit this thing.
It's beautiful.